Stay with Taboo Customs. Today we're going to take a look at the installation of our YJ front driver side frame repair kit that handles the area around the steering box mounting. Now here we have a early 90s YJ. This YJ actually came in for rear frame repair, and while we were taking a look at the frame, we talked to the customer and we said, hey, did you notice that your front is starting to rust out as well? Now when you're looking at these, what you're going to end up starting to see, and this one's a little bit difficult because the customer really couldn't see that the frame was rusted out. If you notice right here, there's a small hole and it goes through the frame, and you can see that the frame has started to crack right along there, which is pretty typical. Now one of the things you also might notice, this frame has been damaged and repaired before, and it looks like the track bar mount here actually broke away from the frame at the bottom. Someone went in and repaired it, but when they repaired it, they really only plated the outside. They didn't repair any of the bottom side, so the bracket is still broken away and it's still flexing. And you can see how it's cracked this piece here. So, you know, one of these things with these Jeeps, when you go in and you do the rust repair, our kit is made to handle typically specific things like the issue here. There might be other issues that you'll have to make sure you take into account and fix at the same time that you're doing this rust repair. So our kit for the most part will take care of this, but my guess is once I start taking it apart, I'll probably have to make a couple of little pieces just to reinforce that bracket back to the frame. Alright, so we saw how the outside of the Jeep didn't show a whole lot of signs of the rust, just that small hole and a little crack starting to develop. Now on the inside, once we took the steering box off and started taking some other things off, you can see here how there is actually a large hole through the frame that you couldn't see from the outside, and that has to do also with the reason that the track bar bracket broke off. So to get started, we had to remove some of the items from the front of the Jeep. Obviously we had to remove the front bumper, the cover that was over the front of the frame here, the plastic cover, and then the bracket that held the brake line up here at the front of the frame as well. And then we unbolted the center of the grill so that we could get a little bit of play in the grill to raise the grill up, and we did, and we supported it with a little block, a 2x4 block over here, just to give us a little space to work with the side of this frame. Now next is the steering box, which is the most difficult part to remove, and if you still have the stock sway bar, that's also a bit of a pain. Now some hints on that. On the passenger side, the sway bar is pretty easy to remove. So start on the passenger side, remove the two bolts on the passenger side for the sway bar. Then for this side, you can remove the front bolt for the sway bar, but the rear bolt you can't really get to because this track bar bolt will be in the way if you still have the track bar. Now removing this track bar bolt is typically not very easy. It's going to be more difficult than what we're planning on doing here with the steering box, but you can also remove this track bar bolt if you'd want. So for this rear bolt for this side of the sway bar, what we did is we loosened up the steering box from the frame. Now on the frame with the steering box, these side bolts typically come out pretty easily, but the bottom bolts do not. Pretty much every frame that we have done for a YJ, these bottom bolts have either broken off or the nuts have spun up in the frame. And with this one, both of the nuts spun up in the frame, and you can see that because now the nut is loose inside the frame when it's supposed to be welded there. You know, and that's a big reason for this kit, because the kit will cut out this bottom section. We'll replace that with a new 7-gauge plate with new 1/2-inch nuts welded to the top of it. Now once you get these loose and we cut these bottom bolts loose and we pulled the side bolts out, we can then manipulate this steering box to push it over a little bit to gain access to the back side of that, to the back bolt for the sway bar, so that you can remove it, and it makes it quite a bit easier. Now once you get that done, you can push this push the steering box over out of the way, and then you can continue to remove the bracket for the steering box, which will have two bolts to the bottom of the steering box here, because we'll actually need to use this bracket when we weld up part of the kit. So let's go over what you'll get with your driver's side kit. So with the kit, you'll get an outside plate, which is 10 gauge, which is the larger plate. You get a little bit smaller 10 gauge plate for the inside. You get another plate 10 gauge for the back side of the front spring hanger. Then for the bottom, as I mentioned, we'll be replacing the whole bottom section of the frame. So you get a thicker 7 gauge plate with 2 weld nuts so that we can replace the weld nuts that are inside the bottom of the frame. Then you'll get a small gusset that goes between the inside of the frame and the track bar mount to help tie the track bar to the inside plate of the kit. Now with this, you might want to think about some other areas of your Jeep since you've already got it disassembled. So we do also have a kit for the passenger side to do the passenger side front frame area. And then we also have a kit for this area on the top of the frame. Now we do sell that kit separately because if you do one of these and not the other, then you're going to have a grill that sits a little lopsided. So if you are looking at doing this, you might want to look at going ahead and getting that kit and adding it to this one because they're not very expensive to do. One thing I failed to mention earlier is we'll also need to remove the upper shackle bushings here at the front of the frame. Now, the reason for that is we're going to go in and we're going to weld to this bracket. We don't want to melt those bushings any. Now, we do have new bushings available on our website if you do need new bushings whenever you do this operation. Or we also have this whole bracket. If you find that this bracket is damaged or rusted out and not in good shape, you can replace that bracket with a new bracket. We have those available on our website. So the next step here will be to start marking out where we'll need to clean up the frame. So to do that, you can put the plates, both the outside plate and the inside plate, it'll work similarly. Put them up against the frame. For these plates on the outside, you'll want to try to keep the holes symmetrical or concentric with the tubes that go through the frame. And then you can mark out the top of the frame, the back side. You know, obviously we're going to need to clean up around those tubes around the front of the frame, and then also mark the shackle hanger at the front so you know where to clean up the front. Now you'll want to take the inside plate and do the same thing on the inside plate. You'll want to mark around the area at this front tube here, the cross member tube, across the top. Now the rear portion really comes up against the track bar mount and you can't really get back there and clean or weld, and that's the reason we actually have a bracket that will attach to our track bar mount. And we'll clean up that track bar mount a little bit later once we get to the inside of the frame. You'll also want to mark out on the inside where we'll tie this bracket into this top shackle hanger as well. So as mentioned, all frames can be a little bit different. With this one, we have an additional bracket back here, additional plate we're going to have to deal with. Typically, you'll usually only have this plate that you'll have to deal with. And whenever we deal with that one, what we'll do is we'll actually cut this plate off at the top, and then here at the bottom, we end up cutting this section of the frame out. We'll cut down along the sides of this plate, and then we'll remove that whole plate. And the reason for that is that we want our outside plate to sit as flat as possible against this frame so that we can get a good weld around these tubes without adding a whole lot of height to the tubes. Now because this plate is here, it looks like it is welded in pretty well, and it's a thicker plate. It extends a little bit past our kit. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to leave this plate. I'm still going to cut this piece out just to make sure that whenever I clamp these, I can get the outside plate over against the frame as much as possible. Also with this, you can kind of see on this frame, you know, the OEM welding sometimes isn't that great. There's a lot of spatter here. There's a lot of that stuff that you're actually going to have to go in there and clean up before we can go and attach these plates on the inside and the outside. So obviously with any of the rust repair kits, you're going to have to remove the rust so you can weld it on. Now the more time you spend on this step here, the better and easier it's going to be for you to install the kit in the later steps when you do have to weld those kits on. So the first thing that we will do whenever we're doing one of these kits, we will go in and we'll try to knock off all the heavy scale. And we'll either use a hammer to kind of tap on the frame to knock off the big chunks of rust. Then for us, we like to use a needle scaler to go in. We'll pretty much needle scale the whole thing, trying to break up any pieces that are in there, clean up the frame. It does real good at taking off the large chunks. And after that, the two big things we'll use is a wire wheel. We will wire wheel the whole area where we're installing the kit. And then we'll go in with a die grinder, either a 90 degree die grinder with a small pad on it, or a straight die grinder with a small bit. The reason for that is even with the wire wheel, you'll have some areas that are pitted, and you want to take those pits down as close as you can to bare metal, or you will have issues with welding. And then with the straight bit, we'll go in and we'll get into some of the corners here. We're going to do welding, especially like on this kit. This area is problematic because it's difficult to get in there even with the wire wheel. So we'll go in there with the small bit and try to clean up some of that area. And pretty much that will apply for any of the rush repair kits you're going to install. So for the next step, we'll need to cut out the bottom section of this frame. Now in the kit, you'll actually have some instructions that will help you. In here, you'll have a couple of dimensions to look at, and they're both from the front of the frame. The first one is a 4 3/4 inch dimension, so you'll want to place a mark at 4 3/4 from the front of the frame, and then 13 3/4 from the front of the frame, which basically is these two marks here. And then you can cut up, about a 1/2 inch, and actually, you can cut out more than that, but you need to cut out at least a 1/2 inch to make clearance for our new plate. So we cut that whole bottom section of the frame out, and then we can move to creating the assembly that we'll put on the inside and the bottom with the nuts. So now we've got the bottom part of our frame cut out, but before we get to that, we're going to go ahead and assemble the inside plate and the bottom plate with the two weld nuts. So the first thing you can do is you can take your steering box bracket, and there's a good chance there's going to be a little dowel at the back here. You'll need to cut that piece off so you can put the bottom plate on. The bottom plate will go with this edge, the tapered edge, pointing out of what would be the frame. And then make sure you use the weld nuts that came with the kit for this bottom plate. The weld nuts will locate inside those holes. They should sit down inside of them to self-locate. And go ahead and thread the two bolts, and you'll have to provide these bolts yourself. They're just 1.5 inches, I think 1.5 inches, 1/2 inch bolts. Don't tighten it down too much because you may have to adjust it. Then you can take your inside plate and install it on the other side of the steering box bracket. And with this, you'll need the 2.5 inch 1/2 inch bolts, and then just regular nuts, and be sure not to weld these nuts in. So once you get those two plates on our bracket, what you'll see is you actually have a little edge up here that meets this bottom plate, will meet the side plate, kind of sits in, and it'll make a decent joint here so we can put a weld at the front and the rear of those two plates on the outside. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll solid weld this on the inside, so we have a solid weld for the inside plate to the bottom bracket. And then remember to make sure to weld these two nuts onto the bottom plate, but do not weld the side nuts, just the two nuts that are located in that bottom plate. Once we have this all welded up, we'll let it cool before we remove it from the steering box bracket, and then we'll take it to our frame and make sure what we notched out, make sure it fits correctly in that notch. Alright, so we've welded up our inside plate and our bottom plate. We've welded the nuts to the bottom plate, we've solid welded the inside, and we've put some welds on the outside here as well, just to keep it lined up. So next we'll need to install this assembly onto the frame. And you can see here we've already cut the frame out. Now our measurements on the print are conservative. We actually had to cut out about 1/4 inch to 3/8 of both the front and the rear to make sure we fit this up in here. And the reason we're conservative on that is that's easier to cut more than it is to try to add material back in. So you're going to want to take this plate and test fit it several times to get your cuts exactly right. Now for this step we will need some tools. We'll need a ratchet or an impact with a 5/8 socket, an 11/16 wrench for the inside. You'll need a couple of 7/16 nuts which are not provided in the kit. And then you can use the stock bolts that bolt the steering box in that go through the frame. Now these bolts are 2 different lengths, so make sure you put the correct bolts in the correct holes. So we can take our bracket, and eventually we'll finagle it into place. Probably the wrong bolt, but we'll see. That was. So the longer bolt actually goes in the front, shorter bolt goes in the rear. You can take your 2 nuts, just put them on those 2. They should be 7/16 threaded bolts. So now before we start tightening those down, what we're going to do is we're going to check the height. Because when we tighten it down, we're really just trying to take that out inside plate, because the inside plate is pushed out a little bit because of this front cross member. We're going to try to bring that inside plate up against the inside of the frame so we can start tacking it in. But before we do that, we're going to want to make sure that our height is correct. And the bottom of this plate should be roughly where the bottom of the frame was before. So in the back we had to go up quite a ways. And on this one, in the front, we had to go down a little bit. And then once you get that lined up, you go ahead and start tightening these bolts. Once you tighten them a little bit, you're going to want to recheck your alignment, because I can already see we dropped in the back. Tighten it up a little bit. Like I said, you pretty much want it flush with where the bottom of the original frame was at. If it's a 16th off, it's not a huge deal, but you want it pretty close because you want your holes to be lined up correctly. So once you have that, you can tighten down these bolts to the sides. And you can't see it, but as we're tightening the bolts down, the inside plate is actually closing up against the frame. And recheck your alignment. And once you're happy with it, you can go ahead and start tacking the inside plate to the frame. And you'll probably also need to clean up this bottom edge, and you can put a weld like here on ours. Since we cut it so close, we've got a good joint down there to be able to put a weld between our track bar bracket and the bottom of the frame. And the same thing up here at the front here, we'll put a weld there as well. We also have a plate that will go over that, but we'll put that on later. So the inside plate and the bottom plate is now tacked to the frame. And if you do have a 91 to 95 YJ, one of the things you're going to have to do is you're going to have to remove the air box to get to the welds on the inside. They'll actually be inside the engine compartment. And once you do remove that air box, you will have a pretty good area down here to be able to get down to that plate. You'll get your welder down in there. Now you do have hoses and things here, and what we did is we used a weld glove. We just shoved it down there between the hoses and the frame to protect those hoses, and we did tack that in place. On the outside, we used a weld blanket to protect the grill whenever we did weld here, and we put a tack here, and you can see that we still have a pretty large gap here, and we'll close that up whenever we go to solid weld it. And the reason for that large gap is we want to try to get tied into this front cross member as solid as we can, so we actually went a little bit farther forward than trying to come right to the edge. So now that that's installed, we can work on the outside plate. The outside plate's pretty simple. It'll go over, you know, the holes for the steering box. Now ours is going to be a little bit more difficult because we have this extra plate, so we're going to actually have to clamp this a little bit harder than we normally would. So you put these over the holes for the steering box. You can see it'll kind of sit on top of that bottom plate, and you can take your clamp, and this is where it's important to have a good C-clamp, one that's not going to strip out or bend or break on you. We put it over, and we've left the steering box bracket connected to the frame on the bottom. We've pulled the side bolts out, and we can start to pull that over. Now we can line it up where we would like it. Clamp it over. Like I said, with this one we're going to have a little bit more of a difficult time because of that extra plate we left back there. So we're going to have this where it kind of bubbles out. So we're going to have to clamp this several times to get it flush against the frame. So once we have this clamped over, we'll go ahead and we'll put some tacks along this area that's clamped, and then we'll move our clamp and keep doing that as we move from the inside of the plate to the rear of the plate and to the front. Now here at the front, you can try to weld and tack this inside. Sometimes this part of the frame is completely gone, so you'll want to focus more on trying to get welds to this tube, but with this frame it's actually pretty solid up the front, so we should be able to get welds up there as well. Alright, so I've got the outside plate tacked up, and we want to start on the last two little plates that will go with this kit. Now this plate here, the little gusset, it will go on the inside, and it'll go between the inside plate and the track bar bracket. It's a little ways back there. You can see, so this plate will actually go right there and tie the inside plate to the inside of the track bar bracket. And you can see where we've cleaned up the track bar bracket, and we'll use these pliers to hold it back there and just weld it in place, and then we can weld everything solid and clean up once we have that there. So the last piece of the kit is this little rectangular piece with the rounded corners. Now this piece is used to tie in the back of the shackle hanger to the bottom of the frame. Now we've gone in, and like I said, with this kit, because this extra plate is going to be a little bit more difficult, you can see here, typically when installing this kit, you're going to have about a 3/16 to a 1/4 inch of area here to get a good weld, because I wanted to make sure that we had the ability to get a good weld between this outside bracket and the bottom bracket, since that's really what the steering box is mounted to. You see I had to put a lot of tacks along here, do some extra little bending, and I got it conformed to the back side of this frame. So now with this, I've also had to take and pull these two pieces in to the spring hanger. I tacked them in place, and now we're in good shape to go ahead, tack this bracket in, and then we can weld everything solid. Now one thing that is optional with this is that we do have an additional kit that if you are installing these pieces, you might want to look at. Now this frame wasn't too bad, but it did have a hole underneath the little support on the outside of the grill. We do have a kit that can go up there and replace that. Now the reason we don't have these in the kits for the individual sides of the frame is that if you were to put this on one side and not the other, then your grill is actually going to sit a bit lopsided. So this is a separate kit. It'll have two of these plates, and it'll actually go in there. It covers, it goes over where the bracket for the brake line bolts, and then you can weld it into this kit on both the sides, the front, and on the back. Like I said, it is optional. It will be available on our website, taboocustoms.com. So now that we've got this all tacked up, we get our plate here tacked up, and then we'll weld it solid. Alright, so we've welded up our kit on this frame. We'll talk about a few of the areas that you might struggle with when you're going in and welding it. Now, one of the areas is going to be this front area of the frame. This is sometimes completely rusted out, so you may not even have anything up here to weld, but weld to what you can. Sometimes if the spring hanger is really rusted out, we've only ran into a few of those where it's gone too far, and a lot of those, if it's gone too much to weld to, you're going to want to replace this front spring hanger. We do carry these on our website. These areas here usually go pretty well. You'll have a good area to weld to down here from the side plate to the bottom plate, and then typically around these holes here are pretty good to weld to. We haven't had many issues there. You will want to watch that you don't burn through into the tube. You want to keep that tube clear, and then you will want to go in and grind the faces of those tubes so they're flat, so when you clamp those bolts, put those bolts back in there, that they will have a flat surface that they're resting on. Back in here, as long as the frame is still solid, you'll be pretty good. If you do have a lot of rust back there, you may need to add a plate at the back to try it. You'll just kind of like they did here to cover that rust, but typically you don't see too much back in this area as far as the rust through. Now on the inside, went pretty much the same as the outside. There is a couple exceptions. There's an area down here that's going to be really hard to get to underneath the grill. It's for us with our gun, there's about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch that we really can't weld. So we welded as much as we could at the front, which is about 4 or 5 inches, and then 2 to 3 inches here at the back by reaching through the engine compartment and welding up the inside. They obviously won't be able to weld the back side of the inside plate because it's underneath the track bar bracket. That's why we added that little gusset in there, and we've welded that solid as well. And then we've welded the corner down here solid, and we've had to do a little bit of grinding, make sure that the bracket for the steering box will still go up there. So we did grind that a little flush in a couple of spots that were a little bit raised. Back here at the back, you'll want to weld to the track bar bracket if you didn't do it earlier. And then the same thing up here, you'll want to weld this solid as well. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this helped out with the installation of your kit, or if you were looking to see what our kits cover, this helped you to show what the kit does actually contain and what areas of the Jeep it does cover. If you are looking to purchase a kit, you can visit taboocustoms.com. We'll have our kits available there. Or if you have a question or comment or concern with your kit, please go there and click the contact us button and send us an email, and we'll get right back to you. So thanks for watching, and as always, like or subscribe.